on.
Yes.
Especially between Christians and Jews. And we go back to Jesus somehow. We have to go back to Jesus.
Before they were Christians, when they were only Jews, right? Because obviously Jesus and his followers were all Jews, as you know.
Well, I remember a college professor friend of mine who begins his year by asking his students a range of questions just to test their general knowledge. And one of the questions is, what religion was Jesus? And he reports this is at an elite college. The majority of students every year put down he was a Christian.
Well, that would have surprised him, as you know, because he certainly saw himself as a Jewish, a devout Jew, a prophet, and was called rabbi. Of course, it's translated teacher in the New Testament. So, you don't see that it's actually the term rabbi.
So, looking at it on the ground, what do we see if we're on the ground with Jesus himself in the year 29, the year 30? I mean, who is this man?
Well, this man is enigmatic, for one thing, and charismatic, obviously, and powerful in some way. I tend to think Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher who was announcing that the end of time was coming, that God was going to come and judge the world. He sounds a lot like the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, the people we call Essenes out there in the desert, who really thought that the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, the wealthy, the priests, who were collaborating with Rome and participating in Roman rule over their people, were traitors. And that the true worship of God would be reestablished when Jews, threw the Romans out, got rid of that imperial rule over them, and reestablished God's kingdom in Jerusalem. Certainly that's what the Romans thought he was about.
So when Jesus is identified in the Gospels as opposed to the chief priests, we could read that as an authentically committed Jewish objector to a kind of collaboration. Is that right?
Yes, that he was a Jewish, a devout Jew who believed that God alone should rule the people. And,
not Rome.
Right. And before Jesus was born, there was an uprising in Galilee against Rome. And actually, it's very much like the American Revolution. They said they were fighting in the name of God and our common liberty. And that was what we might call the Jewish Revolution. And it turned, as you know, into a terrible disaster. And they say that there were crosses all over Galilee. There were 4,000 crosses. It's just like a forest of crosses, because it was an army of men who'd rebelled against Rome.
So when we remember Jesus' cross, we should have that broader context in mind. This is the cross of an anti-Roman resistor in some way.
Well, the Romans thought of the cross as a billboard. This is a public advertisement of what not to do if you want to live. The Jewish people were sort of started a revolution in the name of God and our common liberty, and Roman troops finally marched in, 60,000 troops from Rome. And 2 emperors fighting this war finally devastated the inner city, set the temple on fire, burned down the whole inner city, which was the temple of God.
The inner city of Jerusalem.
The inner city was just in rubble, and thousands of people were killed.
So what did this mean to the religious movement that was sparked by Jesus?
It's striking. The followers of Jesus, they were accused of being seditionists against Rome. And what they said in defense was, no, we're not seditionists against Rome, and neither was our leader Jesus of Nazareth. Actually, the Romans knew he was innocent of the charge.
And how did the story then get told with the Jews cast as the villains here?
Well, it's an extraordinary twist, the way the stories are told in the New Testament Gospels. Everybody knew that Jesus had been crucified. Crucifixion is what the Romans do. Jews certainly don't crucify anybody. And crucifixion was what the punishment for people who were accused and found guilty of sedition against Rome. So we know this was a Roman charge, a Roman punishment, and a Roman execution. But it's startling that if you read the Gospels, you'd think it was the Jews that engineered it.
Why? How did that happen?
I think it worked like this. It only made sense to me, Jim, when I began to think about the fact that the Gospels are really wartime literature. These Gospels didn't just drop from heaven in a golden cloud. They were written by people writing under duress, writing under pressure, writing in wartime. with a lot of stress and difficulty trying to interpret the story in a way that they felt would sound right. And yet, it became a way that followers of Jesus tried to argue their innocence, because what they do is they picture Pilate, who is known to be historically, as you know, as a very brutal, ruthless man, who outraged the Jews. In every way, he just trampled on their religious sensibilities. But in the gospel stories, he becomes more and more benign. From the earliest story to the later story, Pilate becomes more and more generous, fair-minded, and trying to spare Jesus. And people had pointed that out. But what I realized when I began to work on this is that as Pilate becomes more and more benign, the Jews supposedly become more and more malignant. That is, the nicer Pilate is, the more evil they become and the more intent on having Jesus crucified. The story is very twisted.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yes.
Eyewitnesses? I mean, who are these people?
Well, the tradition says they were eyewitnesses, of course. But actually, you know, these Gospels are written at least 30, 40, 50, 60 years after the death of Jesus.
So when you read the details, for example, of the story of the death of Jesus,
yes,
the various things that happened, the sun turns dark at noon, and Jesus is thirsting, and where do these details come from if they're not eyewitness reports?
Well, you know, if you look at paintings, often his followers are standing there, you know, his mother and John. Well, that's from the Gospel of John. But the earlier texts all say something much more likely, that they'd all fled. The men were terrified because they could be easily arrested. The women watched from a very far distance. So probably nobody saw those details. I think what they did was figure out, you know, what would have happened. And when they read passages in the Psalms, they added details that were quite likely, like, you know, the Romans, you know, somebody would take the prisoner's property, something like that. So
in Psalm 22, there's a line or two about they will cast dice for my garments,
right,
which is read as a kind of messianic prophecy.
Well, they would say, that must be about Jesus.
And right? So then the oral tradition is composing the story of the death of Jesus. And how does that detail come into it?
Well, you know that, for example, I mean, Mark says Jesus, when he died, said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And you know that comes from Psalm 22. Luke says he died saying, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. That's from Psalm 31:5. So the details are often taken out of the Psalms.
So the Psalms are the favorite hymns of Jews because they're Jewish sacred scripture.
Yes.
Now what Christians call the Old Testament.
Right.
And so what we have here are groups of Jews in grief, remembering Jesus, turning to their sacred hymns.
Turning to their sacred scriptures and saying, oh, look, it says here, he was despised and rejected. You know, he suffered more than anyone. That must have been Jesus.
And we don't really know which of these details is historical and which is not. But suppose for a moment, for example, that the robe wasn't historical. Suppose there was no robe that Jesus was wearing that the soldiers gambled for. But now in the text, there is this robe. Later, Christians read that then as a fulfillment of a prophecy.
Yes.
They say, yes, there was a robe. Look at the psalm. It was predicted. Right. Therefore, the story of Jesus is true. Here's yet more proof that the story is true.
Exactly. And then, of course, you can find the robe.
And then the robe is found.
The robe was found.
And the robe is found by Constantine's mother.
That's wonderful.
So by the time you get to the Gospel of John, how would you characterize it?
Well, the Gospel of John, as you know, has Jesus speaking to the Jews, and the Jews are trying to kill him as if he weren't a Jew. Yeah. It's absolutely amazing. He even says terrible things, that they belong to Satan.
Elaine, you're a Christian.
Yes.
I'm a Christian. How do we... This is basic to our tradition, this text, the sacred text, the Gospel of John. And yet there is this slander against the Jews embedded in it. How does our faith survive such a thing?
Well, it isn't just...
Why do we blame the Jews? Generation after generation, where does this contempt come from? trying to figure out where it all went wrong between Christians and Jews. And we go back to Jesus. We have to go back to Jesus.
Before there were Christians, when there were only Jews, because Jesus certainly saw himself as a devout Jew, a prophet, and was called rabbi.
How did the story then get told with the Jews cast as the villains here?
Well, it's an extraordinary twist, the way the stories are told in the New Testament Gospels. It says, basically, that it was the Jewish leaders who arrested Jesus, who tried him, who sentenced him to death, and who basically duped the Romans into crucifying him.
Is that true to history?
It looks completely at odds with what we know about history. We know this was a Roman charge, a Roman punishment, and a Roman execution. But it's startling that if you read the Gospels, you'd think it was the Jews that engineered it.
At every Good Friday service, with the reading of that Passion narrative, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, it really hits the ear. And Jesus is against the Jews. And I don't know how else Christians can hear this story.